England, 1823. Some secrets burn hotter than the flames meant to destroy them. The rain hammered against the tall windows of Stirling Hall with relentless fury, each gust of wind rattling the ancient panes as though the storm itself sought entry to witness what transpired within. Lady Alara Stirling stood motionless in the library, her black morning gown blending into the shadows cast by the single candelabra on the desk. The fabric hung loose on her frame, testimony to weeks of grief and burden that had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones and darkened the skin beneath her eyes. Her father, Viscount Stirling, had been dead for 3 days. The funeral had been a sparse affair, attended by few and whispered about by many. Now, in the suffocating quiet of the house that would soon belong to creditors, Alara faced a task that made her hands tremble despite her resolve. The letters lay scattered across the mahogany desk, their yellowed papers covered in elegant script that she knew as well as her own. Each one represented a promise she had made to a dying man, a vow that weighed heavier than any debt her father had left behind. She lifted the first letter, her fingers brushing over the broken wax seal, and moved toward the fireplace where flames crackled and hissed. "Forgive me," she whispered to the empty room, though whether she addressed the dead or the living, she could not say. The first letter curled and blackened in the fire. Then the second. She worked methodically, feeding the flames one confession after another, watching years of secrets transform into ash and smoke. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not stop. She could not stop. The sound of raised voices echoed from the entrance hall, followed by heavy footsteps on marble. Alara's heart lurched, but she forced herself to continue. 2 more letters, then 3. The pile on the desk diminished as the fire grew brighter, smoke beginning to fill the room with its acrid scent. "Madame, you cannot simply barge in here." The butler's protest carried clearly through the corridors. A woman's shrill voice responded, "I am mistress of this house, and I shall do as I please." Augusta. Alara's stepmother had been orchestrating her own salvage operations since the moment the Viscount had drawn his last breath. No doubt she was attempting to hide what little jewellery remained before the creditors came to claim everything of value. But there was a third voice now, deep and commanding, cutting through the chaos with the authority of one born to power. "I require no announcement. This house and everything in it now belongs to my family's estate until the debt is satisfied." Alara froze, another letter halfway to the flames. That voice. She knew it only from brief encounters at society gatherings, formal exchanges that had never progressed beyond courtesy. Adrian Coldthorpe, Duke of Langford, the primary creditor, the man her father had ruined, the man whose brother had died because of secrets she now burned. Her paralysis lasted only a moment. Then she threw the remaining letters into the fire in quick succession, her movements frantic. The flames leapt higher, hungry for the offering. The library door burst open. Adrian Coldthorpe filled the doorway, tall and imposing even in his travel-stained coat. Rain had darkened his black hair and dampened his shoulders, and his eyes, pale blue and cold as winter ice, swept the room in a single assessing glance. They landed on Alara, then moved to the fire where smoke now billowed in thick clouds. "What are you doing?" His voice was dangerously quiet. Alara straightened, forcing her hands to still at her sides, though they ached to continue their work. One letter remained on the desk behind her, the last one, the one that explained everything. She had to reach it before he did. "My Lord Duke," she managed, her voice rough from smoke and grief. "I was not expecting." "What are you burning?" He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his focus entirely on the fireplace. "Documents? Financial records? Tell me you have not destroyed evidence of hidden assets." "No, Alara moved to position herself between him and the desk, but he was already past her, drawn by the smoke and the unmistakable scent of burning paper. He looked into the fire and his expression darkened. Fragments of letters remained visible in the flames, corners not yet consumed, words still legible in places. Then his gaze snapped to the desk where the final letter lay, half hidden beneath a ledger. "Stop!" Alara lunged forward, but Adrian was faster. His hand closed around the letter at the same moment she reached for it, and for a breathless instant, They stood frozen, both gripping the same yellowed paper, so close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and smell the rain-drenched wool of his coat. "Release it," he commanded, his voice like steel. "Please," she whispered, abandoning dignity in desperation. "Please, you do not understand." But he pulled, and she had neither the strength nor the leverage to resist. The letter tore free from her grasp. Adrian stepped back toward the fire, unfolding the paper, even as Alara made one final, futile attempt to stop him. She grasped his arm. "Do not read it. I beg you." He shook her off, not roughly, but with enough force that she stumbled. And then he was at the fireplace, holding the letter close to the flames for light, beginning to read. Alara watched his face as comprehension dawned, watched the way his eyes moved across the lines, the way his jaw clenched tighter with each word. She saw the exact moment he recognized the handwriting, saw recognition give way to shock, shock to confusion, and confusion to something far more dangerous. He read aloud, his voice void of emotion. "Alara, I am sorry for what we did with the regimental accounts. The weight of this secret is killing me. You were the only one who saw me as I truly am, not as my family believed me to be." His hand began to tremble. The paper shook. "It is signed," he continued, his voice now barely audible above the storm. "Edward Calthorpe." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as though the room itself held its breath. Adrian slowly lowered the letter, his eyes lifting to meet Alara's. "My brother," he said, and there was devastation in those two words. "My brother wrote this to you." Alara could not speak. Her throat had closed entirely. "We," Adrian repeated, focusing on that single word. "He wrote we, what we did." His gaze sharpened, the grief transforming into something harder, more accusatory. "You and him? Or him and your father? Who conspired to steal from the regiment? Who destroyed my brother?" "No," the word broke from her. "It was not like that." "Then tell me," the shout echoed through the library. "Tell me what it was like. Tell me why you were burning letters from my dead brother, letters that speak of crimes and secrets." She wanted to explain. Every fibre of her being screamed at her to tell him the truth, to make him understand that everything he believed was a lie. But she had made a promise. She had sworn on Edward's deathbed that she would protect his memory, that his family would never know the shame of what he had truly been. "I cannot," she whispered. Adrian stared at her, and she watched his expression close, watched sympathy and confusion harden into cold certainty. He looked down at the letter again, then at the fireplace where ash drifted like black snow. "How many letters were there?" he asked quietly. She did not answer. "How many?" His voice rose. "How many pieces of evidence have you just destroyed? Evidence of what truly happened to the money, to the regiment's funds, to my family's fortune?" But she could not finish because Adrian Calthorpe moved with sudden violence, not toward her, but toward the fire. Before Alara understood his intent, he had thrust his hand directly into the flames, snatching at a corner of paper that had not yet been consumed. "No!" She lunged forward, grabbing at his arm, trying to pull him back. The heat seared her own hands as she caught his wrist and yanked with all her strength. They fell backward together, landing hard on the carpet. Adrian's hand was closed around a fragment of another letter, his palm already blistering, but his grip did not loosen. He rolled away from her and stumbled to his feet, breathing hard, cradling his burned hand against his chest while holding the charred paper fragment in the other. Alara pushed herself up, her own hands throbbing. "You fool!" she gasped. "You could have been burned." His laugh was bitter. "I have been burned by your family before, Lady Alara. What is a little more fire?" He unfolded the fragment with careful fingers. Most of the text had been destroyed, but a few lines remained visible, written in that same familiar hand. "The debt crushes me," Adrian read. "Father paid it all, even though it meant his own destruction. He did it to save. The rest had burned away." Adrian looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the terrible machinery of his mind working, assembling pieces into a picture that was both right and utterly wrong. "Your father," he said slowly. "My brother wrote that your father paid a debt, the debt that ruined the Sterling family. He paid it to save Edward. His voice dropped to a whisper. From what? Elara said nothing. She could not speak without betraying everything. From exposure, Adrian continued, answering his own question. From prosecution. Your father paid Edward's debts to hide his crimes. He took a step toward her. But that means Edward was guilty. My brother, who I believed was corrupted by your father's influence, was actually... He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. You do not understand, Elara said, her voice breaking. Please, just let it rest. Let the dead keep their peace. Peace? Adrian's hand tightened on the burned letter fragments. My father died believing himself betrayed by a friend. My family spent years trying to understand how the Sterling fortune was built on our ruin, how your father could have stolen from us. And now I find that it was Edward all along, that my brother was the thief, and your father was... What? His accomplice? His victim? Stop, she pleaded. Why were you burning these letters, Elara? He advanced another step. Why destroy them unless they contain truth you want hidden? What did Edward do that was so terrible you would rather be thought a villain yourself than let it come to light? She backed away until the desk stopped her retreat. I made a promise. To whom? To him. To Edward. Before he died. Something flickered across Adrian's face. You were with him when he died. I was. The admission cost her, but she owed him that much at least. Why? Because he asked for me. Because he had no one else. Adrian stood very still. The burned fragments of letters drifted from his injured hand to the floor, forgotten. He loved you. It was not a question, but she answered anyway. He thought he did. And you. I pitied him. The word hung between them, stark and painful. Adrian's expression shifted, and for a moment she thought she saw understanding there, or the beginnings of it. But then his jaw set and the coldness returned. You will tell me everything, he said. Every word of those letters, every secret they contained. You will explain what Edward did, what your father did, and what role you played in all of it. I cannot or will not. Both. He stared at her for a long moment, his burned hand now pressed against his side, his breathing controlled despite what must be considerable pain. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing the windows in waves. Finally he spoke. Then you leave me no choice, Lady Elara. This house is forfeit to my family's estate as of this moment. I will conduct a full inventory and investigation of every document, every ledger, every scrap of correspondence that remains. He gestured toward the ashes in the fireplace. Whatever you sought to hide by burning those letters, I will uncover through other means. There is nothing to uncover, she said desperately. The letters contained only personal matters, private grief. Lies. The word was flat, final. I am many things, Lady Elara, but I am not a fool. Those letters contained evidence, and you have destroyed it. That alone tells me how damning their contents must have been. He turned toward the door, then paused. Pack what you can carry. You have until morning before my men arrive to begin the inventory. After that, you will have to make do with whatever charity your stepmother can provide. Wait. Elara moved toward him. Augusta has no resources. She will cast me out. I have nowhere. Then perhaps you should have considered that before you burned the only evidence that might have exonerated your family. His voice was without mercy. Good evening, Lady Elara. I suggest you use the remaining hours wisely. He left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Elara stood alone in the library, surrounded by smoke and ash and the scattered remnants of secrets that even fire could not completely destroy. Through the window, she saw his carriage pull away into the storm, taking with it the last fragment of a letter that contained both truth and damnation, salvation and ruin. She sank to her knees before the dying fire, cradling her burned hands, and wept for promises that would destroy her, for a dead man's honor, and for the living man whose hatred she had just earned by protecting him from a grief he would never understand. The storm raged on through the night, and by morning nothing would ever be the same. Dawn broke grey and cold over Stirling Hall. Elara had not slept. She sat in her chamber, still wearing the soot-stained morning gown from the night before, watching the pale light creep across the floor. Her hands, wrapped in crude bandages she had applied herself, throbbed with each heartbeat. The burns were not severe, but they would scar. A permanent reminder of the night she had chosen silence over salvation. The sound of carriages on the gravel drive reached her even through the closed window. Not one carriage, but several. Adrian Calthorpe had wasted no time assembling his forces for the occupation of Stirling Hall. A sharp knock preceded the entrance of Martha, her lady's maid, whose reddened eyes betrayed a sleepless night of her own. "My lady, the Duke has arrived with his men. He requests your presence in the drawing room immediately." "Requests or demands?" Ilara asked quietly. Martha hesitated. "He was quite firm, my lady." "Of course he was." Ilara rose, her body stiff from hours of sitting. "Help me change, Martha. I will not face him looking like a common scullery maid." 20 minutes later, dressed in a fresh black gown that hung no less loosely on her frame, but at least bore no evidence of last night's destruction, Ilara descended the stairs. The entrance hall had transformed into something resembling a military operation. Men in the Duke's livery moved through the rooms with ledgers and measuring tapes, cataloguing every painting, every piece of furniture, every candlestick. Augusta's voice carried from the morning room, shrill with outrage. "This is barbaric! We are in mourning! Have you no decency?" A calm male voice responded, though Ilara could not make out the words. She continued toward the drawing room, where Martha had indicated the Duke awaited. He stood by the window, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. In the daylight, his figure was no less imposing than it had been in shadow. His coat, dark blue superfine wool, fit his broad shoulders without a wrinkle. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, spoke of a man who maintained standards even when dealing with the ruins of other people's lives. "Lady Ilara." He did not turn. "Close the door." She did, the soft click seeming unnaturally loud. "You move quickly, Your Grace. I have learned that delays allow for further destruction of evidence." Now he turned, and she saw that his right hand was bandaged, the white linen stark against his dark clothing. His eyes, cold blue in the morning light, assessed her with the same thoroughness his men applied to her family's possessions. "Did you sleep?" "No. Neither did I." He moved to the settee and gestured for her to sit. When she remained standing, his jaw tightened. "Sit down, Lady Ilara. What I have to say will take some time." She sat, primarily because her legs had begun to tremble. He remained standing, a tactical choice that allowed him to look down at her, to control the space between them. "I have spent the night reading what little correspondence from my brother I could locate in my own archives," he began. "Letters he sent home from his posting, reports from his commanding officer, financial records from the regiment. The picture that emerges is not one I wish to see, but I am not a man who turns away from unpleasant truths." Ilara said nothing. Her bandaged hands lay folded in her lap. "Edward was in debt," Adrian continued. "Substantial debt, incurred through gambling. The amounts he owed would have destroyed our family's reputation had they become public knowledge. 3 months before his death, he wrote to me asking for money. I refused, believing it would teach him responsibility." His voice remained steady, but something flickered in his expression. He never asked again. "Your Grace." "I am not finished." The words cut through her attempted interruption. 2 months later, those debts were paid. All of them. The amounts were recorded as coming from an anonymous benefactor. But I now believe that benefactor was your father, the Viscount Stirling. Ilara's breath caught. He had pieced together more than she had anticipated. "What I do not understand," Adrian said, moving closer, "is why. Why would your father pay Edward's debts? What hold did my brother have over him? What did Edward know, or do, or threaten, that would compel the Viscount to bankrupt his own family to protect mine?" She met his gaze steadily. "I cannot tell you." "Cannot, or will not?" "Both." His hand clenched at his side, the bandaged one, and she saw him wince. "You realize how this appears? Your refusal to speak, the burned letters, the evidence of some conspiracy between Edward and your family. It all points to one conclusion: that you and Edward were involved, romantically or criminally, or both. That whatever scheme destroyed both our families, you were at its center. That is not true. Then tell me what is true. The shout startled them both. Adrian turned away, his shoulders rigid. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that dangerous calm. Do you know what I believed for 7 years? I believed your father corrupted my brother. I believed Edward was an innocent boy led astray by an older man's greed. I mourned him as a victim. He faced her again. Now I find that Edward wrote to you of crimes, of debts, of secrets that drove him to his grave. And you stand there, silent, protecting him still. Why? Because I loved him, she said. And it was the truth, though not in the way Adrian would interpret it. Because he was broken and frightened, and alone at the end, and I promised him that his family would never have to know the depths of his fall. His fall from what? From grace? From honor? Adrian's voice hardened. Tell me plainly, Lady Alara, was my brother a thief? The question hung in the air between them. Alara opened her mouth, then closed it. The promise. The vow. Edward's desperate eyes in those final days, begging her to let him be remembered as the golden son, not the wretch he had become. I cannot answer that, she whispered. Then you answer it by your silence. Adrian moved to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. The inventory will take 3 days. When it is complete, this house will be closed and its contents sold to settle the debts owed to my estate. Your stepmother and half-sister will be provided with the dower house on the Sterling lands and a modest pension. You, however, present a different problem. Alara's head snapped up. What do you mean? You possess knowledge that directly affects my family's honor and my brother's memory. Knowledge you refuse to share. I cannot allow you to simply disappear into society with these secrets intact. He opened the door, then looked back at her. You will accompany me to Langford House in Kent. There you will remain under my supervision until you choose to speak, or until I uncover the truth through other means. You cannot be serious. Alara rose, her voice shaking. You intend to hold me prisoner? I intend to hold you accountable. His expression was implacable. You have burned evidence, refused to cooperate, and admitted to a promise that prioritizes a dead man's reputation over the living truth. Until I understand what Edward did and what role your family played, you will remain where I can ensure you cause no further damage. This is illegal. This is kidnapping. This is justice. Adrian stepped into the hallway, then turned back once more. Pack what you need for an extended stay. We depart in 2 hours. If you attempt to leave before then, I have men stationed at every exit. Do not test me on this, Lady Alara. You will not like the results. He left her standing in the drawing room, alone with the sound of his men systematically dismantling her life, item by catalogued item. The journey to Kent took the better part of a day. Alara sat across from Adrian in his well-appointed carriage, the leather seats soft beneath her, the interior warm despite the continued grey weather. Under different circumstances, it might have been comfortable. As it was, she felt like a criminal being transported to trial. Adrian read correspondence for most of the journey, his bandaged hand moving carefully across the pages. He had not spoken to her since they departed Sterling Hall, had not acknowledged her beyond ensuring she entered the carriage. Augusta had tried to intervene, shrieking about propriety and scandal, but Adrian had silenced her with a single look and the promise that the dower house arrangements would be finalized within the week. Kitty had cried, clinging to Alara's arm. Where is he taking you? Alara, I am frightened. Hush, Alara had told her half-sister, smoothing the girl's blonde curls. Everything will be managed. Look after your mother. Try to keep her from making things worse. Now, watching the countryside roll past, Alara wondered if anything could be worse than this. Exiled from her home, held captive by a man who despised her, bound by a promise to a ghost who had already cost her everything. We will arrive within the hour, Adrian said, startling her from her thoughts. It was the first time he had spoken since they left Sterling Hall. Langford Manor is the principal seat of the dukedom. You will be given chambers in the East Wing. You will take your meals in your rooms unless I specifically request your presence elsewhere. You will not leave the manor grounds without my explicit permission, and you will be accompanied at all times by a member of my household staff. A guard, you mean, if you prefer that term." He set aside his correspondence. "I am not a cruel man, Lady Alara. I take no pleasure in this arrangement. But neither will I allow you to escape with the truth still hidden. And if I never tell you what you wish to know, then you will remain at Langford until one of us dies, or until you realize that the dead do not deserve more loyalty than the living." The carriage turned onto a long drive lined with ancient oaks. Through the trees, Alara caught glimpses of grey stone, of mullioned windows, of chimneys rising against the darkening sky. Langford Manor emerged like something from a tale, beautiful and imposing and utterly foreign. As the carriage stopped before the main entrance, liveried footmen descended the steps to attend them. Adrian exited first, then offered his unbandaged hand to assist Alara. She had no choice but to take it, to allow him to guide her from the carriage and up the steps into the home that would become her prison. The entrance hall was magnificent. Black and white marble floors, a double staircase sweeping upward, portraits of Caldthorpe ancestors gazing down from panelled walls. Servants stood in formation, ready to receive their master. "This is Lady Alara Sterling," Adrian announced to his staff. "She will be staying with us indefinitely. Mrs. Crawford, please show her to the East Wing chambers we discussed. See that she has everything she requires for her comfort." The housekeeper, a severe woman with iron-grey hair, curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace. This way, my lady." Alara followed her up the stairs, acutely aware of Adrian watching her ascent. At the landing, she looked back. He remained in the entrance hall, his face tilted up toward her, expression unreadable in the shadows. Then he turned away, and she was led deeper into the house that would hold her, into rooms that were lovely and comfortable and utterly inescapable, into a captivity built not of chains, but of secrets too dangerous to speak and too precious to abandon. The door to her chamber closed with a soft, final click. 3 weeks passed at Langford Manor with the slow, measured quality of water wearing away stone. Alara fell into a routine that was both privilege and punishment. Each morning, Mrs. Crawford brought her breakfast on a silver tray, the porcelain fine, the food excellent, served with a coldness that made every bite difficult to swallow. Each afternoon, she was escorted to the library where she spent hours organizing the Duke's extensive collection, cataloguing volumes, repairing bindings, creating order from what had been decades of benign neglect. The library became her sanctuary and her cage. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories tall with a gallery running along the upper level, accessible by a spiral staircase of wrought iron. Tall windows faced south, flooding the space with light on the rare days when the clouds broke. Thousands of volumes lined the shelves, some dating back centuries, their leather spines cracked with age, their pages yellowed but precious. Adrian had given her this task without explanation, simply informing Mrs. Crawford that Lady Alara would work in the library each day from 1 o'clock until 5. Whether he meant it as occupation to keep her from boredom or as labour to pay for her keep, she could not determine. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. The Duke remained an enigma, appearing at odd hours to retrieve books or documents, acknowledging her with a curt nod, before disappearing again into whatever investigations consumed him. She saw him more clearly through his library than she ever had in conversation. His tastes ran to history and philosophy, military strategy and agricultural innovation. There were novels too, tucked away on higher shelves, works by Defoe and Swift, poetry by Wordsworth and Coleridge. She found a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets with passages underlined in faded ink, notes in the margins written in a younger hand. Edward's hand, she realized with a pang. The Duke had kept his brother's books, had preserved them, even when he believed Edward corrupted and lost. The servants made their opinions clear without words. They did not meet her eyes in the corridors. They set down trays and withdrew as though she carried contagion. She overheard whispers from behind closed doors, cruel assumptions about her relationship with Edward, speculation about why the Duke kept her at Langford. She must have bewitched the young master, one maid said to another as Alara passed in the hallway, their voices deliberately loud enough to carry. Got her claws into him and drove him to ruin. Now she's working on the Duke himself, mark my words. Alara kept walking, her spine straight, her face composed. She had endured worse than servant gossip. She would endure this too. But the isolation wore on her. She had no friends here, no allies. Even Martha had remained at Stirling Hall, unable to follow her mistress into what everyone assumed was disgrace. At night, alone in her comfortable chamber with its blue silk wallpaper and soft feather bed, Alara stared at the ceiling and wondered how long she could maintain her silence. How long before the loneliness broke her, before the weight of the secret crushed her completely. Adrian spent his days in his study, surrounded by documents that had arrived from London in sealed boxes. Regimental records, financial ledgers, correspondence from Edward's commanding officers. He read until his eyes burned, searching for the truth hidden between lines of formal military language and carefully balanced accounts. The discrepancies were there, small at first, then growing. Money transferred from the regimental funds to cover equipment purchases that were never recorded in the quartermaster's logs. Amounts that corresponded exactly to Edward's gambling debts, paid off in installments over the course of 6 months. His brother had been stealing from the regiment, systematically, desperately, feeding an addiction that would have destroyed him had it been discovered. Court-martial, imprisonment, the ruin of the Caldthorpe name. Edward had stood on the edge of that abyss, and then someone had pulled him back. Viscount Stirling. It had to be. The timing aligned with the sudden decline in the Stirling family fortunes. With the debts that had accumulated until the Viscount's death, he had impoverished himself to save Edward. But why? The question haunted Adrian through sleepless nights and distracted days. Why would a man sacrifice everything for someone else's son? What connection had existed between Edward and the Stirling family that would inspire such loyalty, such ruinous generosity? The answer, he knew, lay with Alara. She held the key to understanding, but she guarded it more fiercely than any fortress wall. On a grey afternoon in the 3rd week, Adrian descended to the library to retrieve a volume on crop rotation he needed for correspondence with his land steward. He found Alara perched on the rolling ladder, reaching for a tome on the highest shelf, her black morning dress stark against the brown leather spines. She did not hear him enter. He watched her stretch, saw the fabric pull tight across her shoulders, revealing how thin she had become. The dress itself, he noticed for the first time, was of good quality but old, mended at the cuffs and collar, with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She wore the same dress every day, he realized. The same gown, laundered each night by a maid and returned each morning. How many dresses did she own? He had assumed she travelled with a modest wardrobe, but now he wondered if she possessed anything beyond what she wore. The thought disturbed him more than it should. Alara descended the ladder with the book in hand, turned, and started when she saw him. The volume slipped from her grasp. Adrian moved instinctively, catching it before it hit the floor. Their hands met on the book's cover. For a moment, they stood frozen, too close, the leather warm between their palms. "Forgive me," she said, stepping back. "I did not hear you enter." "Clearly." He set the book on a nearby table. "You seem absorbed in your work. It gives me purpose." Her voice was carefully neutral. "Thank you for allowing it." Adrian studied her face in the afternoon light. She looked tired, the shadows beneath her eyes more pronounced than they had been at Stirling Hall. Her hair, once elaborately dressed, now hung in a simple braid down her back. She wore no jewellery, not even mourning pieces. Everything about her spoke of reduction, of loss pared down to absolute essentials. "Are you well?" The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "Well enough, Your Grace." "You are not eating properly. Mrs. Crawford reports that most of your meals are returned barely touched." A flash of something crossed her face. Anger, perhaps, or embarrassment. "I have little appetite." Grief or guilt? Her jaw tightened. Does it matter which? Before Adrian could respond, a commotion erupted outside the library windows. Raised voices, the sound of something heavy falling. They both moved to look. In the stable yard, visible through the library's tall windows, several grooms had gathered around a figure on the ground. One of the stable hands, a young man named Thomas, whom Adrian vaguely recognized, lay crumpled on the cobblestones, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. A horse, apparently spooked, reared and snorted nearby, while the grooms attempted to control it. "He needs help," Alara said, already moving toward the door. Adrian caught her arm. "Mrs. Crawford will send for the physician. By the time the physician arrives from the village, he could be in shock." She pulled against his grip. "Please, Your Grace. I have some skill with injuries. Let me help him." He should refuse. She was not a servant to be dispatched for such tasks. She was his prisoner, held for answers she would not give, but something in her expression, a desperate need to be useful, to help rather than merely exist, made him release her. "Go," he said. She went, not waiting for him to reconsider, lifting her skirts and moving through the corridors with swift purpose. Adrian followed, curious despite himself. By the time they reached the stable yard, Thomas was conscious, but grey, with pain. Alara dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the mud and blood staining her dress. "Thomas, is it?" Her voice was calm, soothing. "I am going to examine your leg. This will hurt, but I need to know if the bone has broken through the skin." The young man nodded, teeth gritted. Alara's hands moved with surprising confidence, gently probing the injury through torn fabric. Adrian watched from several paces away, transfixed by the transformation in her. Here, allowed to act rather than merely endure, she became someone entirely different, focused, competent, kind. "The bone is not compound," she announced, "but it is certainly fractured. We need to immobilize it before moving him. Bring me 2 straight pieces of wood, approximately this length." She indicated the measurement with her hands. "And strips of cloth for binding. Clean strips if possible." The grooms scrambled to obey, responding to her authority without question. Adrian said nothing, merely observed as she fashioned a splint with materials brought to her, as she spoke quietly to Thomas throughout, distracting him from the pain with questions about his family, his horse, his duties. "Where did you learn this?" Adrian asked, when the makeshift splint was secured, and Thomas had been carefully moved to a wagon for transport to the physician. Alara stood, her dress ruined, her hands dirty, strands of hair escaping her braid. "My mother taught me. She believed that ladies of quality should know how to tend the sick and injured on their estates, that it was a responsibility that came with privilege. Your mother was wise." She was. Alara looked down at her soiled dress, seeming to notice its condition for the first time. "I should change, with your permission." "Granted." He paused. "That was well done, Lady Alara." She met his eyes, and for a moment the wall between them thinned. "He is only a boy," she said softly. "Hardly older than Edward was when—" She stopped, the wall slamming back into place. "I will return to the library once I have made myself presentable." She left him standing in the stable yard, surrounded by grooms who now looked at her retreat with something other than contempt. Adrian turned to find his head groom, Daniels, watching him with an expression of careful neutrality. "Something to say, Daniels?" Adrian asked. "Not my place, Your Grace." "Say it anyway." The older man hesitated. "The young lady has gentle hands. Thomas will remember that kindness." Adrian said nothing, but he thought about gentle hands that had wrapped bandages made from her own stockings, about a woman who fell to her knees in mud to help a servant, who owned perhaps 3 dresses and asked for nothing, who carried a secret that destroyed her rather than betray a promise to the dead. That evening, a letter arrived from Stirling Hall. Adrian recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. Augusta Stirling's elaborate script, all flourishes and affected elegance. He opened it with reluctance. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. Augusta wrote of her reduced circumstances, of poor Kitty's bleak prospects, of the many small expenses required to maintain even the modest standards of the dower house. She hinted at debts incurred on the assumption that the Stirling situation would improve. She wondered, in language carefully calculated, whether the Duke might see fit to increase their pension, given his own family's complicated history with dear departed Edward. Blackmail, thinly veiled. Pay me, or I will speak of Edward's sins. Adrian set the letter down with disgust. So this was the woman who had raised Ilara after her mother's death, this grasping, manipulative creature who viewed everything through the lens of profit and loss. He thought of Ilara's single mourning dress, mended at the cuffs. He thought of her refusal to ask for anything, even basic necessities. He thought of the contrast between stepmother and stepdaughter, and for the first time, he wondered if his assumptions about the Sterling family had been too broad, too undiscriminating. Perhaps not all of them were villains. Perhaps some were victims too. The thought unsettled him deeply. He had spent 3 weeks treating Ilara as a conspirator, an accomplice to whatever Edward had done. But what if she was something else entirely? What if her silence protected not herself, but someone she had loved despite his unworthiness? Adrian rose and moved to the window of his study. Across the gardens, he could see the east wing where Ilara's chambers lay. A single light burned in her window. He imagined her there, alone with her secrets, wearing her mended dress, eating nothing, enduring his suspicion and his household scorn, all to keep a promise to a ghost. "Who are you, Ilara Sterling?" he murmured to the glass. The window offered no answer, but Adrian felt the first crack forming in his certainty, the first seed of doubt taking root in soil that had been frozen solid with grief and anger for far too long. The letter from Augusta arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who had ridden through the night from Stirling Hall. Adrian read it over breakfast, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set it beside his plate with deliberate care, the kind of control that suggested barely contained anger. "Mrs. Crawford," he called, and the housekeeper appeared with her usual promptness. "Inform Lady Ilara that she will need appropriate attire for a London ball. Have the dressmaker from the village attend her this afternoon." Mrs. Crawford's eyebrows rose fractionally. "The London season, Your Grace. We depart in 3 days." He returned his attention to his correspondence, dismissing her with the gesture. The news reached Ilara an hour later. She stood in the library, a volume of agricultural treatises open before her, when Mrs. Crawford delivered the Duke's instructions with an air of severe disapproval. "A ball?" Ilara repeated, certain she had misheard. "The Duke insists you accompany him to Lady Pemberton's season opener in London. A dressmaker will arrive at 2 o'clock to take your measurements." The housekeeper's tone suggested this was both scandalous and inexplicable. "You are to select fabric for 1 evening gown." After Mrs. Crawford departed, Ilara sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing. Why would Adrian take her to London? To parade her before society as evidence of the Sterling family's disgrace? Or had Augusta somehow forced his hand? The dressmaker, a nervous woman named Mrs. Talbot, arrived precisely at 2 with an assistant and several books of fabric samples. She measured Ilara with efficient hands while maintaining a stream of nervous chatter about the weather, the roads, the challenges of creating an acceptable gown in only 3 days. "The Duke was very specific about the allowance," Mrs. Talbot said, showing Ilara a selection of fabrics. "Nothing too dear, but quality nonetheless. Perhaps this charcoal silk, appropriate for morning, but with enough sheen to be suitable for evening." Ilara touched the fabric, its softness foreign after weeks in her worn black bombazine. "It is too fine." "The Duke selected it himself, my lady. Sent his man to my shop yesterday with instructions." Mrs. Talbot lowered her voice. "Between us, I believe he felt the matter urgent. We are to work through the nights if necessary. So Adrian had planned this before Augusta's letter arrived. But why? Ilara agreed to the charcoal silk because she had no real choice, submitted to the measurements and the pinning of muslin patterns, and tried not to think about facing London society as the Duke of Langford's prisoner. 3 days later, they departed for London in Adrian's travelling carriage. The journey took most of the day, and they passed it in near silence. Adrian read documents while Ilara watched the countryside transform gradually into the outskirts of the city, the green fields giving way to villages, then towns, then the dense sprawl of London itself. Langford House in Mayfair was smaller than the Manor in Kent, but no less grand. A townhouse of pale stone with black iron railings, positioned on a square where other noble families maintained their London residences. Elara was shown to a chamber on the second floor, told to rest before the evening's event, and left alone with her thoughts and growing dread. The gown arrived an hour before they were to depart. Mrs. Talbot had outdone herself. The charcoal silk caught the light with subtle elegance, the bodice fitted perfectly, the skirt falling in graceful lines. Elara dressed with the help of a lady's maid Adrian had assigned to her, a young woman named Betsy, who worked in practiced silence. When Elara examined herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the figure reflected there. The woman looking back appeared almost elegant. The severe mourning dress transformed into something that suggested dignity rather than disgrace. Her hair, dressed in a simple but sophisticated style, revealed the delicate bones of her face. She looked like what she had been once, the daughter of a viscount, a lady of quality. The illusion would shatter the moment they entered the ballroom, she knew. Society had long memories and sharp tongues. Adrian waited in the entrance hall, resplendent in black evening clothes that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders. His cravat was tied in an intricate knot, his boots polished to a mirror shine. When Elara descended the stairs, she saw his eyes widen fractionally before his expression returned to its usual controlled neutrality. "You look well," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you." She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. "May I ask why I am here?" "You will understand soon enough." The carriage delivered them to Lady Pemberton's residence in Grosvenor Square. Even from the street, Elara could hear music, could see the glow of hundreds of candles through the windows. Her stomach clenched with anxiety. They entered together, ascending the stairs to where Lady Pemberton received her guests. The elderly countess's eyes sharpened when she saw Adrian, then moved to Elara with undisguised curiosity. Langford! What a delightful surprise! And this must be… She paused meaningfully. "Lady Elara Sterling," Adrian said calmly. "Daughter of the late Viscount Sterling. She is staying at Langford as my guest." The word guest hung in the air, laden with implications that Lady Pemberton clearly noted. "How interesting. Do enjoy the evening." They moved into the ballroom proper, and Elara felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward them. Conversations faltered, then resumed with increased intensity. The whispers began immediately. "Is that the Sterling girl? I heard her father died penniless. Wasn't there some scandal with Langford's brother? What is the Duke thinking bringing her here?" Adrian's hand covered hers on his arm, a brief pressure that might have been meant as reassurance or warning. They moved through the crowd, Adrian nodding to acquaintances, Elara keeping her expression serene despite the humiliation burning through her. Then she saw Augusta and Kitty. Her stepmother wore emerald silk that was cut just a shade too low for propriety, her neck draped with jewels that Elara knew Augusta could not possibly afford. Kitty, beside her, looked lovely in pale pink, her blonde curls arranged artfully, her expression nervous as she scanned the room. Augusta's eyes locked on Elara, and something triumphant flashed across her face. She had orchestrated this, Elara realized, had forced Adrian to bring them to London by threatening some scandal, and now she would use the opportunity to position Kitty as the Duke's appropriate choice, while Elara served as the cautionary example of fallen virtue. "Langford!" A booming voice interrupted her thoughts. Lord Pemberton, their host, approached with a group of gentlemen. "Capital to see you in town. We were just discussing the proposed changes to the corn laws. What is your position?" Adrian was drawn into conversation, leaving Elara standing alone at the edge of the ballroom. She considered retreating to the refreshment room, but before she could move, a woman materialized beside her. Lady Cecily Wortham was beautiful in the way that certain women weaponized beauty. Golden hair, perfect features, a figure displayed to advantage in crimson silk. She had been one of the season's reigning beauties for 3 years running, and her engagement to a wealthy earl had only increased her social power. "Lady Elara," she purred, her smile sharp. "How brave of you to show your face after all that unpleasantness with your father. And poor Edward Calthorpe, of course. Such a tragedy." Elara met her gaze steadily. Good evening, Lady Cecily. I must say, I admire your courage. Or is it desperation? Cecily's laugh was musical and cruel. Tell me, does the Duke know about your little arrangement with his brother? Or are you hoping to keep that secret buried along with dear Edward? I have nothing to hide, Elara said quietly, though her hands trembled. No. How peculiar. Because the entire ton is wondering why Langford keeps you at his estate. What services you must be providing to earn such protection. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. But perhaps you learned those skills from Edward. He always did enjoy teaching his conquests new tricks. The words struck like physical blows. Elara felt heat flood her face, felt tears threaten despite her determination not to show weakness. Excuse me, she managed, turning away. Cecily's hand shot out, catching Elara's arm. Oh, don't run off. We are just becoming acquainted. She lifted her other hand, which held a glass of red wine. Let me toast your remarkable resilience. What happened next occurred too quickly to prevent. Cecily's hand tilted, the wine sloshed, and suddenly the front of Elara's beautiful new gown was soaked in crimson, the liquid spreading across the silk like blood. The conversations around them stopped. Silence rippled outward through the ballroom as heads turned to witness the spectacle. Oh dear, Cecily said, her voice dripping false concern. How clumsy of me! What a pity about your dress! Elara stood frozen, wine dripping onto the polished floor, aware of hundreds of eyes on her humiliation. This was why Adrian had brought her, she thought with sudden clarity, to remind her of her place, to show her what waited if she continued to defy him. Then a voice cut through the silence, deep and cold and furious. Lady Cecily. Adrian stood 3 paces away, and the look on his face made even Cecily step back. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, positioning himself between Elara and her tormentor. That was extraordinarily clumsy, he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. One might even say deliberately so. Cecily recovered quickly. Your Grace, I apologize. Truly, it was an accident. Was it? Adrian pulled a square of white silk from his pocket, his handkerchief, and turned to Elara. Here, he said, his voice gentling. Though I fear it will do little good. Elara took the handkerchief with shaking hands, pressing it uselessly against the spreading stain. Thank you, Your Grace. Perhaps I should retire. Nonsense. Adrian's hand settled at the small of her back, proprietary and protective. The evening has only begun. He turned to face the assembled crowd, his gaze sweeping across titled lords and ladies who had witnessed Elara's humiliation. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. I believe the next dance is a waltz. Lady Elara, would you do me the honor? The ballroom erupted in whispers. The waltz was the most intimate dance, reserved for couples who were engaged or closely connected. For the Duke of Langford to request a waltz with a woman of dubious reputation, a woman many believed had been his brother's mistress, was shocking beyond measure. Your Grace, Elara whispered, my dress is ruined. I cannot. You can, and you will. His hand remained at her back, steady and warm through the damp silk. Trust me. She had no reason to trust him. He had imprisoned her, interrogated her, allowed his household to treat her with contempt. But something in his eyes, some fierce protectiveness she did not understand, made her place her hand in his. He led her onto the floor as the musicians struck up the opening notes of the waltz. His right hand settled at her waist. His left clasped her gloved hand, and then they were moving, turning, sweeping across the polished floor with a grace that surprised them both. Elara was acutely aware of the wine stain on her gown, of the eyes watching them, of the gossip this would generate. But she was also aware of Adrian's hand at her waist, of the way he guided her through the steps with confident ease, of how close they stood, closer than propriety typically allowed. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely audible above the music. Because you do not deserve to be humiliated by women like Cecily Wortham, he replied. Whatever your secrets, whatever your involvement with Edward, you have conducted yourself with dignity. That deserves acknowledgement. They turned, and for a moment the ballroom blurred, becoming just light and music and the warmth of his hand against her back. "I found Edward's diary," Adrian said, and Alara's steps faltered. His hand tightened, keeping her steady. "We will discuss it when we return to Langford House, but I thought you should know. I finally have the truth I have been seeking." Alara's face drained of colour. The diary. She had not known such a thing existed. What had Edward written? What secrets had he recorded that she had burned letters to protect? "Do not faint," Adrian murmured, drawing her fractionally closer. "We are being watched by half of London. Whatever composure you can maintain, maintain it." She drew a shaking breath and forced her feet to continue the steps. Around them, other couples had joined the dance, but Alara felt only Adrian's presence, only the terrible weight of his words. The diary. He knew, or would know, once he finished reading it. And then what? Would he finally understand why she had burned those letters? Or would he condemn her even more for the truth she had hidden? The waltz ended. Adrian bowed over her hand, the gesture formal, but his eyes intense on her face. "We leave in an hour," he said quietly. "Be ready." He escorted her to the edge of the ballroom and left her there, moving to speak with Lord Pemberton about their early departure. Alara stood alone, shaking, the wine-stained dress cold against her skin, and wondered if the secrets she had guarded so carefully were finally, inevitably, about to destroy them both. The journey back to Langford House passed in suffocating silence. Alara sat rigidly in her corner of the carriage, the wine-stained gown stiff and cold against her skin, her mind racing with possibilities she could not control. Adrian sat opposite her, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the carriage lamps, his hands folded in his lap with deceptive calm. When they arrived, he did not escort her to her chambers as she expected. Instead, his hand closed around her elbow, firm but not painful, and he guided her directly to his study on the ground floor. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, the walls lined with books and maps, a fire burning low in the grate. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of two chairs positioned before the desk. Alara sat because her legs would no longer support her. Adrian moved to pour brandy from a crystal decanter, offering her a glass that she accepted with trembling hands. He poured one for himself, then took the chair opposite hers, rather than retreating behind the imposing desk. They were close now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the lines etched deeper than they had been weeks ago. "I'm going to tell you a story," Adrian began, his voice quiet but steady. "You will listen without interruption. When I finish, you will have a choice to make. But first, you will hear what I have learned." He set his brandy aside, untouched, and withdrew a small leather-bound volume from his coat pocket. Edward's diary. The binding was worn smooth by handling, the pages yellowed with age and moisture. Adrian opened it carefully, as though the book might crumble at rough treatment. "My brother began keeping this diary when he was 17, Adrian said, "just after our father died, and I inherited the title. Edward was sent to join the regiment shortly thereafter. A decision I made believing military discipline would shape him into the man our family needed him to be." His mouth twisted bitterly. "I was wrong." He turned pages, scanning entries written in Edward's familiar hand. At first, the entries are mundane. Descriptions of regimental life, complaints about the food, boasts about his horsemanship. Then, approximately 8 months after his commission, the tone shifts. He mentions games of chance. Small wagers at first, then larger ones. He writes about winning, about the thrill of it, about how it made him feel powerful in a world where he felt constantly inadequate. Alara's hands tightened on her glass. She had known about the gambling, had watched Edward destroy himself with it, but hearing it spoken aloud by Adrian was different. It made the tragedy real in a way her silence never could. "Within a year," Adrian continued, "Edward had accumulated debts that exceeded his annual allowance by a factor of 10. He borrowed from fellow officers, from merchants, from anyone who would extend him credit on the strength of the Caldthorpe name. When those sources dried up, he began taking money from the regimental funds." Adrian's voice remained level, but Alara could hear the pain beneath the control. Small amounts at first. Amounts he convinced himself he would repay. But gambling debts compound, and desperation breeds poor judgment. Within 6 months, he had stolen nearly £5,000 from the regiment. An audit was scheduled. Court-martial was inevitable. He turned more pages, his burned hand moving carefully across the paper. Then he writes of meeting you, Lady Alara Sterling, daughter of Viscount Sterling, visiting the garrison with her father during an inspection tour. Edward describes you as kind, as the first person in months who looked at him without expectation or judgment. You spoke to him about books, about poetry. You treated him as a human being rather than a uniformed disappointment. Alara's vision blurred with unshed tears. She remembered that visit, remembered Edward's desperate eagerness for conversation, the way his hands had shaken when he held his tea. He confided in you, Adrian said. Not the full truth, not at first, but enough that you became concerned. Enough that you mentioned it to your father. And that, Alara, is where everything changed. Adrian closed the diary and met her eyes directly. For a long moment he did not speak. The slim volume in his hand seemed to carry the weight of every year he had spent resenting the wrong person. The words he had just read pressed against his ribs like a judgment. He had needed Edward to be only a scoundrel, and Alara's father to be only a convenient scapegoat. Now the pages left him with no refuge from the fact that the truest cowardice had been his own, his refusal to look beyond the wound of a younger brother abandoned. Only when he was certain his voice would not break did he go on. Your father investigated quietly. He discovered the extent of Edward's debts, the stolen funds, the impending audit. He had 3 weeks before the scandal would break, before Edward would be arrested, and the Calthorpe name would be destroyed along with him. Please, Alara whispered, the first word she had spoken since entering the study. You do not need to. Yes, I do. Adrian's voice was gentle now, infinitely sad. Viscount Sterling paid every debt, every penny Edward owed to the regiment, to the merchants, to the fellow officers who would have reported him. He used his own fortune, his daughter's dowries, even mortgaged Sterling Hall to raise the necessary funds. He did it quietly, through intermediaries, so the source of the money could never be traced back to him. Alara's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks unchecked. He did it to protect you, she said, her voice breaking. Not Edward. You, your family name, your position. He knew what scandal would do to the Calthorpe legacy. I know. Adrian's own voice roughened with emotion. Edward writes it all here. How your father came to him privately, told him the debts were paid, but extracted a promise. Edward was to resign his commission immediately, citing ill health. He was to return home and never gamble again. And he was never, under any circumstances, to tell me or anyone else in my family what had truly happened. But Edward could not keep that promise, Alara said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. He tried. He truly tried. But the guilt destroyed him. He drank to forget, and when that failed to provide oblivion, he simply gave up. The fever that took him was almost a mercy. Adrian rose and moved to the fire, staring into the flames. Before he died, Edward wrote those letters to you, confessing everything, begging forgiveness, asking you to ensure I never learned the truth of his cowardice and theft, because he loved me, in his damaged way, and could not bear for me to know what he truly was. Yes, the word was barely audible. And you burned them. Adrian turned to face her. You burned them to protect me from that knowledge, to let me keep the memory of my brother as I wanted him to be, rather than as he was. I promised him. Alara set down her brandy glass before she dropped it. I held his hand as he died, and I promised I would never tell you, that your family would never have to carry the shame of knowing they had been saved by the man they blamed for their suffering. Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees before her chair. The movement was so unexpected, so utterly at odds with his usual controlled dignity, that Alara gasped. He took her hands in his, heedless of the bandages on both their palms, pressing them against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. Forgive me, he said, and his voice broke on the words. Alara, forgive me. I have spent weeks believing you a conspirator, a manipulator, someone who corrupted my brother or was corrupted by him. I kept you prisoner. I allowed my household to treat you with contempt. I subjected you to humiliation and isolation, all while you were protecting me from a truth that would have shattered me. Adrian, your father bankrupted himself to save my family's honor, he continued, the words pouring out as though he could not contain them. And when I inherited the debt he incurred doing so, I used it to destroy you. I took your home. I held you captive. I demanded answers you could not give without breaking a promise made to a dying man. His hands tightened on hers. You sacrificed everything. Your inheritance, your reputation, your freedom, your peace. You endured weeks of cruelty and suspicion rather than reveal the truth. You are the most honorable person I have ever known, and I have treated you as though you were beneath contempt. Tears streamed down Adrian's face now, the first time Alara had seen him cry, perhaps the first time he had allowed himself to weep since Edward's death. I am sorry, he said. I am so profoundly sorry, for my blindness, for my cruelty, for every moment of pain I have caused you. If I could undo it all, if I could return everything I have taken from you, I would do so in an instant. Alara reached down with one hand to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his wet cheek. You loved him, she said softly. You were trying to protect his memory, just as I was. We were both keeping vigil over the same ghost, but you succeeded where I failed. Adrian turned his face into her palm. You preserved something good. I only created more suffering. They remained like that for a long moment, Adrian kneeling before her, Alara's hand against his face, both of them crying for losses that could never be recovered, and truths that had cost far too much. Finally, Adrian pulled back enough to look up at her. What can I do? He asked. How can I possibly make amends for what I have done to you? Alara shook her head slowly. You cannot restore what is gone. My father is dead. Sterling Hall is lost. My reputation cannot be salvaged. These are consequences I accepted when I made my promise to Edward. Then what? Adrian's voice was desperate. Tell me what you need. Anything. Everything. She considered the question carefully. What did she need? What did she want from this man who had been her captor and was now her supplicant? The answer, when it came, surprised her with its simplicity. I need you to let Edward rest, she said. Keep his diary. Keep the truth of what he did and what my father sacrificed. But do not make it public. Let the world continue to believe whatever story brings the least pain to the most people. Let Edward be remembered as you wish to remember him, and let my father's reputation remain what it is. They are both beyond caring now. It is the living who matter. Adrian studied her face for a long moment. And what of you? He asked. What do you want for yourself? I want to stop being afraid, she admitted. I want to stop feeling like I am being punished for the crime of keeping a promise. I want... She stopped, uncertain how to articulate the loneliness that had consumed her for weeks. To be seen, Adrian finished quietly, not as a villain or a victim or a keeper of secrets, but simply as yourself. Yes. The word emerged as a whisper. Adrian rose from his knees but did not move away. Instead, he pulled her gently to her feet, his hands still clasping hers. They stood face to face, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. I see you, Alara Sterling, he said. I see your courage and your loyalty and your terrible, beautiful capacity for sacrifice. I see the way you carry burdens that would crush lesser souls. I see the kindness you showed to a dying boy, to my household staff, to everyone but yourself. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And I see that I have been unforgivably blind until this moment. He released one of her hands to brush away the tears still wet on her cheeks. I cannot undo the past weeks, but I can promise you this. From this moment forward, you are not my prisoner. You are my guest in truth. You may stay at Langford for as long as you wish, with every comfort and courtesy I can provide. Or you may leave, and I will establish you wherever you choose with means sufficient to live independently. The choice is entirely yours. And Sterling Hall? she asked. The debts. Forgiven. Adrian's expression was fierce. All of them. The debt your father incurred saving my family is void as of this moment. I will transfer Sterling Hall back to your name. I will restore what I can of your fortune. It will not be what it was, but it will be enough for security and dignity. Elara stared at him, unable to fully comprehend what he was offering. Why would you do this? Because it is just, he said simply. Because your father saved us, and I repaid him with persecution of his daughter. Because you deserve peace, and I have given you only torment. He hesitated, then added quietly, and because I would like the chance to know you, Elara. Not as prisoner and captor, not as adversaries circling around a dead man's secrets, but as we might have been under different circumstances. What circumstances would those be? She asked, her heart beating too fast. Perhaps, Adrian said, simply as two people who have both loved unwisely and grieved deeply, and who might find in each other's company some measure of understanding. It was not a declaration. It was not even truly a request, but it was an offering, tentative and honest, and it was more than Elara had dared hope for in the darkest moments of her captivity. I think, she said slowly, I would like that too. Adrian's smile transformed his face, erasing years of grief and bitterness. Then we will begin again tomorrow, properly, as equals. Tomorrow, Elara agreed. He escorted her to her chambers, and for the first time since arriving at Langford, Elara felt the weight of her secret finally lifting. The truth had been spoken, the burden shared, and though the path ahead remained uncertain, she was no longer walking it alone. Part 6. The days following the revelation in Adrian's study passed with a gentleness Elara had forgotten was possible. She woke each morning without dread, took breakfast in the sunny morning room instead of her chamber, and walked the grounds of Langford without escort or supervision. The servants, informed by Adrian that Lady Elara was an honoured guest rather than a prisoner, began treating her with courtesy that bordered on warmth. Mrs. Crawford still maintained her reserve, but even she softened when Elara complimented the household management. Adrian kept his promise. He restored Sterling Hall to her name through his solicitors, arranged for a modest but respectable income to be settled upon her, and made no demands upon her time or attention. Yet they found themselves drawn together nonetheless. They took meals in companionable conversation, discussing books and estate management and the slow healing that follows profound grief. They walked the winter gardens, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air, speaking less of the past and more of the uncertain future. It was during one of these walks, 5 days after Adrian had read Edward's diary aloud, that he mentioned his upcoming journey to London. I have business with my solicitors, he explained as they paused beside the frozen ornamental pond. Matters regarding your father's estate that require my signature and presence. I will be gone perhaps 3 days, no more than 4. Elara felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Of course. You need not explain your movements to me. I know. Adrian's gloved hand brushed against hers, whether by accident or design she could not determine. But I wanted you to know that I will return, that you will not wake to find yourself abandoned again. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Elara met his eyes, saw the earnestness there, the need for her to understand that he was not leaving in the way Edward had left, or in the way her father had left through death. I will be here when you return, she said quietly. Adrian smiled, and something passed between them that felt like the beginning of trust rebuilt from ashes. He departed the following morning, his carriage loaded with documents and correspondence. Elara watched from her chamber window as he climbed inside, watched until the vehicle disappeared down the long drive toward London. The house felt larger in his absence, emptier despite the dozens of servants going about their duties. That evening, a letter arrived from Augusta. Mrs. Crawford brought it to Elara in the library, where she had resumed her work cataloguing Adrian's collection. The housekeeper's expression was disapproving as she handed over the cream-coloured envelope, as though she could divine its contents through the paper. From Sterling Hall, my lady, delivered by courier. Elara recognised her stepmother's florid handwriting with sinking certainty. Nothing good ever came from Augusta's correspondence. She waited until Mrs. Crawford departed before breaking the seal. The letter began with false pleasantries that Alara skimmed quickly. Augusta wrote of the dower house, of Kitty's health, of small domestic concerns that meant nothing. Then, in the third paragraph, the true purpose emerged. I have heard the most distressing rumours, my dear Alara, regarding your situation at Langford. London society speaks of your presence there in terms that alarm me greatly. Some suggest the Duke keeps you as his mistress. Others whisper of madness, of how you destroyed valuable documents in fits of mania. I fear for your reputation, but more, I fear for your mind. Perhaps we should consult physicians who specialize in disorders of female temperament. I know of an excellent establishment where young women might receive care for nervous conditions. Do write soon, and assure me of your well-being. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Augusta was laying groundwork, establishing a narrative of Alara's instability that could be used against her. But for what purpose? Adrian had already forgiven the sterling debts, had already restored their property. What more could Augusta possibly want? Alara set the letter aside with trembling hands. She would show it to Adrian when he returned, would ask his advice. Surely Augusta could not cause real harm now, when everything had been resolved. She returned to her work, trying to push the unease from her mind. In the dower house at Stirling Hall, Augusta Stirling sat across from Mr. Horace Grimsby and smiled with cold satisfaction. Grimsby was not a reputable solicitor, which was precisely why Augusta had sought him out. His practice consisted primarily of legal manoeuvres that skirted the boundaries of propriety and occasionally crossed them entirely. He owed Augusta favours from years past, favours she was now prepared to call in. You understand what I require? Augusta asked, pouring tea with hands that glittered with rings she had not yet been forced to sell. Grimsby nodded, his narrow face sharp with interest. You wish to have Lady Alara declared incompetent and committed to an asylum for the treatment of nervous disorders. The legal grounds would be her erratic behaviour, the destruction of valuable property, and extended periods of melancholia. Precisely. Augusta sipped her tea. The Duke's household staff witnessed her burning letters. His own servants can testify that she refused to speak for weeks, that she appeared disturbed and withdrawn. These are not fabrications, Mr. Grimsby. They are facts that require only proper interpretation. And the motivation for this action? Grimsby's pen hovered over his notes. Concern for my stepdaughter's welfare, naturally. Augusta's voice dripped false compassion. As her closest living relative, I have a duty to ensure she receives appropriate care for her condition. What Augusta did not say, what Grimsby understood perfectly well, was the true motivation. If Alara married the Duke of Langford, Augusta's position would become untenable. A Duchess. Alara would have power to investigate Augusta's management of the Stirling household during the late Viscount's final years. Would discover the jewellery sold and not reported, the funds skimmed and hidden. More importantly, she would cut off the modest pension Augusta currently received and potentially expose her to charges of theft. But an Alara committed to an asylum would be powerless, would be forgotten, would be removed from society permanently, her credibility destroyed, her potential marriage impossible. The Duke might feel sympathy for a captive, might even develop feelings for her, but no Duke would marry a woman declared insane by medical professionals and confined to an institution. I will need supporting testimony, Grimsby said. Family members, witnesses to her condition. Kitty will sign whatever documents you prepare, Augusta assured him. She is obedient and will not question the necessity. And the physicians? I know of 2 who can be persuaded to provide the necessary evaluations without actually examining the patient. Their fees will be substantial, but I believe I can manage them. Augusta had already sold the last of her decent jewellery to raise the required funds. It was an investment in her future security. Grimsby made notes, his pen scratching across paper. When did you wish to execute this plan? Immediately. The Duke is in London for several days. We must act while he is absent, before he can intervene. Augusta leaned forward. Can you have the documents prepared by tomorrow? For an additional fee, yes. Then do so. Augusta rose, smoothing her skirts. "I will arrange for the asylum's representatives to call at Langford the following evening. They will present the commitment papers and take Alara into custody. By the time the Duke returns, she will be safely confined, and I will have legal guardianship established." "There is risk," Grimsby warned. "If the Duke contests the commitment, he will not." Augusta's smile was sharp. What gentleman wishes to be associated with a madwoman? He may feel guilty about her confinement, but ultimately he will accept that it was necessary for her own protection. And society will forget her, as they forget all inconvenient women. She departed, leaving Grimsby to his preparations, confident that within days her problem would be permanently resolved. At Langford, Alara spent a restless night, Augusta's letter weighing on her mind. She woke early, dressed, and was breaking her fast in the morning room when the sound of carriages on the gravel drive drew her attention. But these were not Adrian's carriages. Through the window, she saw a plain black coach, unmarked, accompanied by two rough-looking men on horseback. Her heart began to race without understanding why. Mrs. Crawford appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "My lady, there are men here. They have papers, legal documents. They claim they have orders to take you into custody for medical evaluation." "What?" Alara stood so quickly her teacup overturned, tea spreading across the white tablecloth like a stain. "That is impossible. On whose authority? Your stepmother's, apparently, and they have certificates from physicians declaring you unfit. My lady, they mean to take you to an asylum." Terror, cold and absolute, flooded through Alara's body. An asylum was not merely a place for the truly mad. She had heard whispered stories in drawing rooms and servants' corridors of inconvenient wives and troublesome daughters, locked away on the strength of a single signature. In such places, a woman's protests could be catalogued as symptoms, her memories dismissed as delusion. Once committed, she would have no rights, no recourse. Augusta could keep her there indefinitely, could ensure she was lost to society forever. Where are they now? Alara's voice shook. "In the entrance hall. I told them you would receive them in the drawing room, but my lady, I do not think—" Alara did not wait to hear the rest. She fled from the morning room, moving through the corridors toward the servants' stairs at the back of the house. Her mind raced. She could not fight this legally, not without Adrian present. The documents might be forgeries, but she had no way to prove it immediately. By the time anyone could verify their authenticity, she would already be confined, drugged, declared incompetent. She had to run, had to get away and hide until Adrian returned. Alara reached her chamber, threw a heavy shawl over her morning dress, and grabbed the small reticule that contained what little money she possessed. Behind her, she heard voices, footsteps on the stairs. They were coming. She fled through the servants' door, down the narrow back staircase, emerging into the cold December afternoon. Snow had begun to fall, light flakes at first, then heavier. She ran across the stable yard, past startled grooms, into the winter-bare woods that bordered the estate. Behind her, shouts erupted. "There she goes! After her!" Alara ran until her lungs burned, until her thin slippers were soaked through and her feet numb with cold. She ran without direction, knowing only that she had to get away, had to hide until Adrian returned and could prove the documents false. The snow fell harder, transforming from flakes to a wall of white that obliterated the path ahead. Alara stumbled over hidden roots, caught her shawl on bare branches, but did not stop, could not stop. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, she found shelter in what appeared to be the ruins of an old chapel at the far edge of the Langford property. The roof was partially collapsed, but one corner remained intact, offering protection from the worst of the weather. She huddled there, shaking with cold and terror, and prayed that Adrian would return before Augusta's men found her. In London, Adrian concluded his business with the solicitors earlier than anticipated. The documents transferring Sterling Hall back to Alara's name were signed and sealed. The income settlements were established. He had even commissioned a full restoration of the Sterling family tomb, ensuring that Viscount Sterling would be remembered as the honourable man he had been. As he prepared to depart London, something made him reconsider his planned schedule. an unease he could not name, a sense that he needed to return to Langford immediately rather than lingering for the social calls he had planned. He ordered his driver to make haste, and they departed at once, racing through the early winter darkness toward Kent. They arrived at Langford near midnight to find the house in chaos. Lights blazed in every window. Servants ran through the corridors. Mrs. Crawford met him at the door, her composure finally shattered. "Your Grace, thank heaven you have returned. Lady Alara, she has fled into the storm." "What?" Adrian's blood turned to ice. "Explain, quickly." Mrs. Crawford told him everything. The men with false commitment papers. Ilara's panicked flight. The search parties sent out as the snow began falling in earnest. They had found no trace of her. And now, hours later, in freezing conditions, hopes were fading. Adrian did not wait to hear more. He ran to the stables, ordered his fastest horse saddled, and mounted despite the stablemaster's protests about the weather. "Find me lanterns," he commanded. "Every man who can ride, send them out. Search every structure on the property, every shelter. She is out there, and I will not leave her to freeze alone." He rode into the storm, into the howling wind and blinding snow, knowing that every moment mattered, that Ilara's life hung in the balance of minutes and miles. And as he searched, calling her name into the darkness, Adrian realized with terrible clarity that he could not bear to lose her. Not now. Not when they had finally found their way to understanding. Not when he had only begun to know the extraordinary woman she truly was. "Ilara!" His voice was lost in the storm. "Ilara, where are you?" The snow fell harder and the night offered no answer. Part 7. Adrian searched through the storm for what felt like hours, though it could only have been one. Every structure, every shepherd's hut, every barn on the Langford estate was investigated and found empty. The snow fell so thickly now that visibility extended barely beyond his horse's head. Ice formed in his hair and beard, and his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. But he did not stop, could not stop. "Ilara!" Her name tore from his throat, raw and desperate. "Ilara, answer me!" Only the wind replied, howling through bare branches with a sound like grief itself. Then, as he approached the farthest boundary of his property, he saw it. The ruins of the old chapel that had once served the estate before the current parish church was built. Most of the structure had collapsed decades ago, but portions of the stone walls remained, and he remembered that one corner still retained enough roof to provide shelter from rain. Adrian dismounted before his horse fully stopped, stumbling through knee-deep drifts toward the ruins. His lantern cast wild shadows across crumbling stone as he pushed through the broken doorway. "Ilara!" There, in the far corner, beneath what remained of the roof, a huddled shape. Too still. Dear God, too still. Adrian crossed the space in 3 lunging steps and fell to his knees beside her. Ilara sat with her back against the stone wall, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her arms wrapped around herself. Her lips had gone blue, her skin deathly pale, and frost had formed on her eyelashes. She was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered audibly. "Ilara." He touched her face with his frozen hand. "Ilara, look at me." Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused. "Adrian." The word was barely a whisper. "You came back." "Of course I came back." He was already stripping off his heavy riding coat, wrapping it around her. It was damp from the snow, but still held warmth from his body. "Can you stand?" "I do not think so. I cannot feel my feet." Terror shot through him. Frostbite could claim toes, feet, even legs if severe enough. He had to warm her, had to do it now before the cold claimed parts of her that could never be restored. Adrian pulled her away from the wall, positioning himself behind her so she sat between his legs, her back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her over the coat, pulled his own cloak over both of them, and held her against him, sharing what heat remained in his body. "I am so cold," she whispered, still shaking uncontrollably. I know, darling. Stay with me. Talk to me." He needed to keep her conscious, needed to prevent her from slipping into the dangerous sleep that preceded freezing to death. "Tell me what happened." Who were those men? Through chattering teeth, Elara told him. About Augusta's letter, about the forged commitment papers, about the physician's certificates declaring her insane, about how she had run because she knew that once confined, she would never escape. With each word, Adrian's fury grew, but he kept his voice calm, soothing. You are safe now. I will not let anyone take you. I swear it on my life. Augusta wants me gone, Elara said, her shaking beginning to ease slightly as Adrian's warmth slowly penetrated the cold that had invaded her bones. She fears I will expose her thefts from my father's estate, or that you might marry me and give me power over her. She should fear both those things, Adrian said grimly, because I intend to do exactly that. Elara tilted her head back to look at him, confusion in her dark eyes. Do what? Expose her thefts, and marry you, if you will have me. The words emerged raw and unplanned, but once spoken, Adrian knew they were absolutely true. I love you, Elara Sterling. I have been falling in love with you since the moment you knelt in the stable yard to help Thomas. Perhaps even before that. I love your courage and your loyalty, and your ridiculous determination to protect people who do not deserve it. I love the way you organize books by subject rather than size. I love that you give away your own stockings to make bandages. I love everything about you, and I cannot imagine facing the rest of my life without you in it. Tears froze on Elara's cheeks as they fell. Adrian, you are not thinking clearly. The cold has nothing to do with this. He tightened his arms around her. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years. I want to marry you. I want to make you my Duchess in truth, not just in the eyes of my household. I want to spend my days arguing with you about library organization and my nights. He stopped, suddenly aware of the impropriety of completing that thought. Well, my nights in ways that are inappropriate to discuss when you are suffering from exposure. Despite everything, Elara laughed, a weak sound but genuine. You truly wish to marry me, the daughter of your debtor, the woman who burned evidence and refused to speak and caused you nothing but trouble. I wish to marry the woman who sacrificed everything for the sake of a promise, Adrian corrected. The woman who would rather freeze to death than allow herself to be unjustly imprisoned. The woman who saw my brother's humanity when everyone else saw only his uniform or his name. Yes, Elara, I wish to marry you desperately. Then yes. She leaned back against him, her shaking finally easing to occasional shivers. Yes, I will marry you, though perhaps we should survive this night first before making detailed plans. Adrian pressed his face against her hair, overcome with relief and love, and the terror of how close he had come to losing her. For the first time since Edward's death, perhaps the first time since his father's death years before that, Adrian Caldthorpe allowed himself to weep, not the controlled tears of the study, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. I nearly lost you, he said between gasps. If I had been delayed in London by even one day, if I had not felt that urgency to return, I would have come home to find you gone or dead. The thought of a world without you in it is unbearable. Elara turned in his arms, awkward and stiff with cold, but determined. She raised her hands to his face, her fingers like ice against his skin. But you did return. You found me. Adrian, you saved me. You saved me first, he replied. You saved me from becoming the kind of man who could not see past his own pain to recognize honor when it stood before him. You saved me from bitterness and isolation. You saved me, Elara, long before I saved you. They held each other in the ruins of the chapel, while the storm raged outside, sharing warmth and promises and the beginning of a future neither had dared imagine possible. Finally, when Elara's shaking had stopped entirely and colour had begun returning to her face, Adrian stood and lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, made even lighter by weeks of poor appetite and stress. Your horse, she protested weakly, is trained to follow. Adrian carried her out into the storm, which had begun to ease slightly, the snow falling now in gentler curtains rather than blinding walls. His mount stood where he had left it, patient and well-trained. Adrian managed to climb into the saddle while holding Elara, settling her across his lap, keeping her wrapped in both coat and cloak. The journey back to Langford Manor took twice as long as his frantic ride out, but Adrian did not rush. He kept Alara close, monitoring her breathing, ensuring she stayed conscious and warm. As they emerged from the woods and the house came into view, ablaze with lights and activity, Adrian made a decision. He would not take Alara to the servants' entrance or to some side door. He would not hide their arrival or pretend propriety that served no purpose. He rode directly to the main entrance. Servants poured down the steps as they recognized the Duke's horse, relief and excitement in their voices. Mrs. Crawford appeared with blankets. The stablemaster ran to take the horse, but Adrian waved them all back. "Open the doors," he commanded, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "All of you, attend me." The great doors swung wide. Adrian dismounted carefully, keeping Alara secure in his arms. Then, before the assembled household, before every servant and guest who had gathered in hope and fear, he carried her up the steps and through the entrance. In the grand hall, with water dripping from their clothes and snow melting on the marble floor, Adrian made his declaration. "This is Lady Alara Sterling," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "She will soon be my wife and your Duchess. Anyone who fails to show her the respect and honor she deserves will be dismissed immediately and without reference. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, Your Grace" echoed through the hall. "Mrs. Crawford, prepare the Duchess's chambers, the ones that belong to my mother. Fetch the physician and have him attend Lady Alara immediately. I want every comfort provided, and I want her watched throughout the night to ensure no ill effects from the cold. At once, Your Grace." Mrs. Crawford, her reserve finally cracking, added with genuine warmth, "Welcome home, my lady." Adrian carried Alara up the grand staircase to chambers she had never seen, rooms that had been closed since his mother's death. He laid her gently on the massive four-poster bed, and only then released her, stepping back to allow the maids to attend her. "I will return once the physician has examined you," he promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Rest now. You are safe." But Adrian did not rest. While Alara was tended and warmed and examined, he sent riders into the night, one to fetch the local magistrate, another to London to his solicitors, a third to Stirling Hall to inform Augusta that her scheme had failed. By morning, the facts had been assembled. Mr. Grimsby was arrested, attempting to flee to Dover. The physicians who had signed false certificates were identified and their licenses questioned. Augusta's letters to Grimsby, found in his office, provided written evidence of the conspiracy. When the magistrate arrived at noon, Adrian presented him with everything: the forged documents, the testimony of Mrs. Crawford and other servants, the correspondence proving Augusta's intent to unlawfully imprison Alara. "This is a serious matter, Your Grace," Magistrate Thornton said, examining the evidence. "Lady Sterling could face criminal charges." "I want her banished," Adrian replied coldly. "Not imprisoned, though she deserves it. I want her removed from England with a pension barely sufficient for survival. Let her live out her days on the continent, far from anyone she might harm." "And Miss Catherine Sterling?" the magistrate asked. "She signed some of these documents." "Kitty is young and manipulated by her mother," Alara said. She had insisted on attending this meeting, despite the physician's orders to rest. She did not understand what she was signing. Please, show her mercy. Images of Kitty flickered through Alara's mind. The girl who had once crept into her bed during thunderstorms. The young woman who laughed a little too loudly at London suppers in a constant effort to please a mother who never truly saw her. Kitty had been cruel and cowardly in moments that demanded courage, but she had also been raised beneath Augusta's shadow, taught that compliance was the only currency that bought a scrap of affection. Alara could not bring herself to ask for a punishment that would simply carve another wound into a life Augusta had already disfigured. Adrian looked at her. This woman who extended grace even to those who had tried to destroy her, and loved her even more. "Miss Catherine will accompany her mother into exile," he decided, "with the same modest pension. What they make of their lives abroad is their own affair." The arrangements were executed within days. Augusta departed for France with Kitty in tow, the girl weeping and humiliated, but free from criminal prosecution. Grimsby was sent to debtor's prison, his practice dissolved, his reputation destroyed. And Adrian, using his considerable influence in Parliament and society, quietly ensured that the true story of Viscount Stirling's sacrifice became known among those who mattered. The Viscount had not been a debtor who ruined himself through vice, but an honourable man who had impoverished himself to save another family from scandal. The Stirling name was restored, the family tomb was repaired and beautified, and a new plaque was commissioned, reading, "Viscount Stirling, whose courage and generosity saved those who could not save themselves." But Edward's diary remained locked in Adrian's private safe, its secrets protected as Alara had wished. Some truths, they agreed, served the living better by remaining hidden. Part 8. Spring arrived at Langford Manor with hesitant grace, as though uncertain of its welcome after the brutal winter that had preceded it. The gardens, dormant for months beneath snow and ice, began their slow resurrection. Crocuses pushed through the thawing earth in clusters of purple and gold. The ornamental cherry trees along the south drive budded with the promise of blossoms soon to come. Even the air itself seemed different, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth rather than the sharp bite of frost. Alara stood among the roses that were just beginning to show their first tender leaves, her hands bare despite the lingering chill in the morning air. She had spent the winter months recuperating from her ordeal in the chapel, regaining strength and health under Adrian's devoted care and the physician's watchful supervision. The nightmares had faded with time. The fear that had driven her into the storm had transformed into something quieter, a caution rather than terror. Now, 3 months after that terrible night, she was whole again, restored, and restless. Adrian had been everything generous and proper throughout her recovery. He had given her the finest chambers in the house, the same rooms his mother had occupied. He had provided her with a wardrobe befitting a duchess, though they were not yet married. He had spent hours sitting with her as she recovered, reading aloud from books she selected, discussing everything from agricultural reform to the poetry of Keats. He had been attentive, affectionate even, but always carefully appropriate, always maintaining that thin line between devoted suitor and respectful guardian. But he had not pressed for a wedding date, had not mentioned his proposal in the ruins beyond occasional references to "when we are married," that felt more hopeful than certain. And Alara, uncertain of her place now that the crisis had passed, had not asked. She touched the bare rose cane gently, feeling the small thorns beneath her fingertips. These bushes would bloom magnificently in a few months, Mrs. Crawford had told her. Deep red roses that the late Duchess had planted herself 40 years ago. But Alara wondered if she would be here to see them flower. Her father's debts were forgiven. Stirling Hall was restored to her name, though she had not yet returned to visit it. She had an income now, modest but sufficient for an independent life. There was nothing keeping her at Langford except Adrian's invitation to stay as long as she wished, and her own confused heart. She loved him, that much was certain. Loved the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened rather than merely waiting for his turn to talk. Loved his quiet strength and the vulnerability he showed only to her. Loved the way he had wept in the chapel ruins, the way he had carried her through the storm, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching. But loving him and being the right wife for him were different things. He was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England. He needed a duchess who could navigate society without the stain of scandal, who could bring connections and influence to his name. Not a woman whose stepmother had tried to have her committed, whose father had died in debt, whose reputation had been shredded by circumstance and cruel gossip. Perhaps it was time to leave, to establish herself quietly somewhere far from London, where she could live peacefully and allow Adrian to find a more suitable match. The thought brought physical pain, a tightness in her chest that made breathing difficult, but she forced herself to consider it logically. "You look as though you are saying goodbye." Alara startled, turning to find Adrian standing a few paces behind her. He wore riding clothes, his boots still dusty from the morning's exercise, his dark hair windblown. How long had he been watching her? "I was admiring the garden," she said, smoothing her skirts unnecessarily. "Mrs. Crawford tells me the roses will be spectacular this summer." "They are every year." Adrian moved closer, his eyes searching her face. But you did not answer my observation. You look as though you are bidding farewell to them. Elara turned back to the roses, unable to meet his gaze. I have been thinking that perhaps it is time I returned to Stirling Hall. I have imposed upon your hospitality for months now, and you have been nothing but generous. But I am recovered, and you have your own life to resume. The silence that followed was so complete that Elara could hear a robin singing in the cherry tree, could hear the distant sound of a gardener's shears. I see. Adrian's voice was carefully controlled. And our engagement? The proposal I made in the chapel? You were overwrought, Elara said quietly, frightened by the near loss. It is natural to make promises in such moments that seem less necessary in calmer times. I would not hold you to words spoken under such duress. Duress. Adrian repeated the word as though it tasted foreign. Elara, look at me. She did, reluctantly, and found his expression not angry, as she had feared, but hurt. Deeply, genuinely hurt. Do you believe I am the kind of man who makes false declarations? He asked. That I would propose marriage merely because I was frightened, and then spend 3 months courting you out of some misguided sense of obligation? No, but nothing. He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. I love you. I have loved you since long before that night in the storm. I love you this morning, here in the garden, with no danger or duress or dramatic circumstances to cloud my judgment. I want to marry you, Elara Stirling, not because I pity you, not because I feel obligated, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Tears pricked at Elara's eyes. Adrian, I come with nothing but scandal and damaged reputation. You deserve you. He cut off her protest. I deserve you, and you deserve happiness. Everything else is noise. He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket. I have something to show you. Something I should have shown you weeks ago, but I was waiting for the right moment. I think that moment is now. He withdrew a folded paper, yellowed and charred at the edges. Elara recognized it immediately. The letter he had pulled from the flames that first terrible night at Stirling Hall. The letter that had started everything. I have read this letter perhaps 100 times since Edward's diary was revealed, Adrian said, carefully unfolding the fragile paper. Most of it, you know. Edward's confession about the regimental accounts, his guilt, his gratitude to your father. But there was a section at the bottom, partially burned, that I could not fully decipher until recently, when I examined it under better light. He held the letter so they both could see it, pointing to lines at the very bottom where the fire had damaged but not completely destroyed the text. Edward writes here about you, Adrian said, about how you were the only woman who saw him clearly, who did not judge him for his weakness, but simply offered friendship when he most needed it. And then he writes this. His finger traced the faded words. He says, but Elara's heart was never mine to win. She spoke often of a duke she admired from afar, whose correspondence with her father demonstrated a rare combination of honour and intelligence. She said she would never meet this paragon, but if she did, he would be the kind of man she could truly love. I was not that man. I could never be, but perhaps fate will be kinder to her than it was to me. Elara stared at the words, memory flooding back. She had been 18, helping her father with correspondence, when Adrian's letters began arriving. Business matters, negotiations over land boundaries and water rights that bordered both estates. But the letters had revealed a mind she admired, a principled approach to estate management, a concern for tenants that was rare among the nobility. She had indeed spoken of him to Edward, never dreaming that he would record it, never imagining that the man she admired from his written words would one day become so central to her life. I did not know, she whispered. I did not know Edward had written that. Neither did I, until I looked closely. Adrian refolded the letter with careful hands and tucked it back into his pocket. But it explains much. Why you burned these letters so desperately. They contain not only Edward's secrets, but your own. Your feelings for a man you had never met, preserved in writing where anyone might discover them. I was a girl, Elara protested weakly. That was 8 years ago. Foolish romantic notions. Are they still foolish? Adrian asked, cupping her face in his hands. Are they still merely notions? Because I desperately hope, that some part of those feelings remains. That the man you admired from letters might prove worthy of the woman you have become. Ilara could not speak past the tightness in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then marry me," Adrian said, his thumb brushing away her tears. "Not someday. Not when you feel you have earned it or when society forgets to gossip. Marry me now. This spring. In the chapel on the estate, the one that sheltered you when you ran. Let us transform that place of terror into something beautiful. Let us begin our lives together without further delay." "Yes," Ilara managed, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, Adrian. Yes to all of it." He kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, heedless of any servants who might observe from the windows. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Adrian kept his forehead pressed to hers. "I want you to know something," he said quietly. "You did not come to me with nothing. You brought honor, loyalty, courage, and a capacity for love that humbles me. You brought light into a house that had been dark for too long. You brought me back to myself. That is not nothing, Ilara. That is everything." They were married 4 weeks later in the restored chapel, with spring flowers woven through the ancient stones and the entire Langford household in attendance. The ceremony was small by aristocratic standards, but perfect in its intimacy. Ilara wore a gown of ivory silk that Adrian had commissioned from London's finest modiste. Her only jewellery was a pearl necklace that had belonged to Adrian's mother, a tradition for Caldthorpe brides. The wedding breakfast was held at the manor, and for the first time in years, music and laughter filled the great hall. Thomas, the stable hand whose leg Ilara had splintered months ago, proposed a toast to the new Duchess with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Crawford, her severity finally abandoned entirely, admitted that she had never seen the Duke so happy. Even the dower housekeeper dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. 2 years later, on an autumn afternoon golden with slanting light, Adrian sat in the library with Ilara curled beside him on the sofa they had brought in specifically for shared reading. A fire crackled in the grate, though the day was mild enough not to require it. They simply liked the comfort of it, the way it made the vast room feel intimate. On the carpet before them, their son played with wooden blocks, stacking them with fierce concentration before knocking them down with delighted laughter. Henry Edward Caldthorpe, named for both his father and the uncle whose mistakes had paradoxically brought his parents together, had his mother's dark eyes and his father's determined chin. At 18 months, he was already showing signs of the stubbornness they both possessed. "He has your single-mindedness," Ilara observed, watching her son rebuild his tower for the 4th time. "And your refusal to give up when things collapse," Adrian countered, setting aside the agricultural journal he had been reading. "A dangerous combination. We shall have our hands full when he is older." "Indeed." Adrian pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I would not have it any other way." Ilara leaned into his warmth, marveling as she often did at how dramatically her life had transformed. The girl who had burned letters in desperation, the woman who had been imprisoned and hunted, was now a duchess, secure in her position and her husband's love. Stirling Hall had been fully restored and leased to a respectable family, with the income supplementing the Langford estates. Her father's name was honoured throughout the county. Even Augusta's exile had brought a strange peace, knowing that particular threat could never return. But more than any external change, it was the internal transformation that amazed her. She was no longer afraid, no longer carrying secrets that crushed her spirit. She had found partnership, true partnership, with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. On the wall above the fireplace hung 2 portraits, commissioned the previous year. One showed Viscount Stirling in his prime, painted from descriptions and a miniature Ilara had provided. The other depicted a young man in regimental uniform, Edward Caldthorpe at 20, before addiction and desperation had marked him. They were not hidden or forgotten, these men whose choices had shaped so much, but neither did they dominate the room. They were simply there, remembered, and at peace. "Do you ever regret it?" Ilara asked quietly. "Protecting Edward's secret?" You could have exposed everything, cleared your family name completely. Adrian considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked difficult things. No, he said finally. Some truths serve only to cause pain. Edward was flawed and weak, but he was also young and frightened and trying to survive circumstances he created but could not control. He deserves to be remembered as more than his worst moments. As do we all. Little Henry chose that moment to knock down his tower with particular enthusiasm, blocks scattering across the carpet. He looked up at his parents with an expression of such pride that they both laughed. "Again!" the boy demanded, already gathering his blocks. "Again and again," Elara agreed, smiling. "That is the blessing of new beginnings, is it not? We can always build again." Adrian's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We can indeed." Outside, the autumn light began to fade toward evening. The gardens that Elara had admired that spring morning were now heavy with late roses, the last blooms before winter's return. But inside the library, surrounded by thousands of stories and the promise of thousands more to come, the Duke and Duchess of Langford sat with their son and contemplated their extraordinary fortune. The cycle of debt had been broken. The silence had been shattered. The secrets that had nearly destroyed them had instead become the foundation for something stronger, built on truth and trust and love that had survived fire, ice, and every test that circumstance could devise. And in the gathering dusk, with the fire burning low and their son finally sleeping against his mother's shoulder, Adrian picked up the volume of poetry they had been reading together and continued where they had left off, his voice soft in the peaceful room. Some endings, they had learned, were really beginnings in disguise, and some flames, rather than destroying, refined and purified and made precious what remained. Their story had begun with fire. It would continue with light. The end.